The familiar story of Peggy Guggenheim is one of a bohemian, eccentric art collector drifting between Paris and Venice. She appears as a modern figure, surrounded by the defining paintings of the 20th century. This outline contains truth, but it conceals the deep architecture that supported her life. Behind the woman posed over the Grand Canal was a vast structure. That structure included a major banking dynasty, a global mining empire, a mother who openly despised newer wealth, a beloved sister lost in childbirth, and a daughter whose own art was overshadowed. The glamorous collector was born from a dense network of financial mechanisms and powerful female relationships. These forces made her eventual freedom possible, but they also set its clear limits. Peggy was born Marguerite Guggenheim in 1898. She entered a world already defined by layers of institutional power. Her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, belonged to the industrial family that had built immense dynastic wealth from metals. The Guggenheims controlled contracts, built mines and smelting companies, and diversified their holdings across the world. Her mother, Florette Seligman, came from the established Seligman banking family. This family represented one of the older, prominent Jewish financial houses in New York. On paper, the marriage was an ideal alliance. It was capital meeting capital, with industry marrying finance. However, the union was immediately troubled by deep class divides. Records show that Florette considered the Guggenheims vulgar. In her view, their fortune was too recent, and their manners lacked refinement. The daughter, Peggy, grew up with one foot in each conflicting universe. She experienced the brash energy of frontier money and the cold hierarchies of an established banking elite. Within this family structure, female ranking and social control mattered immensely. Florette came from a lineage that understood the subtler forms of authority. Tools like guest lists, dinner tables, club memberships, and marriage choices all functioned as powerful instruments. The Seligmans enforced their standards through quiet, understated authority. The Guggenheims, by contrast, had advanced through sheer industrial force. Their method involved mines carved from mountains, factories built on a huge scale, and negotiations handled with hard edges. Florette's quiet disdain for her husband's family communicated a crucial lesson to her daughters. Money alone did not guarantee acceptance or belonging. Even within privilege, there were layers and boundaries, and mothers actively policed them. Florette was the rigid code parent, focused on cleanliness and propriety, repeating her sentences 3 times as if to fix them in the air. This emotional distance in the household became a primary engine for Peggy's future life. The rooms might be orderly and immaculate, but the atmosphere remained cool and emotionally inaccessible. Peggy grew up alongside her older sister, Benita, who shared the same complicated inheritance. Benita appeared to be the more conventional daughter, socially aligned and positioned for the expected role of a Seligman Guggenheim woman. She followed the script of her class, structuring her life around marriage, the hope of children, and pregnancy. Peggy, younger and less traditionally beautiful, watched this process from slightly outside the centre. This vantage point, close enough to understand the machinery, yet distant enough to question its purpose, would define both her romantic choices and her eventual career in the art world. Furthermore, Benita became an emotional anchor in the household. While their mother was distant, Benita was the emotional trustee who soothed Peggy and explained adult decisions. The first shattering break in this structure arrived not from finance, but from a disaster at sea. In 1912, Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the Titanic. The story that survives is one of dramatic composure. As the ship began to sink, he reportedly changed into evening clothes, stating he wished to go down like a gentleman. Reports describe him assisting women and children into lifeboats before vanishing into the North Atlantic. For his daughters, the legend of bravery was less significant than the simple fact of absence. The father, who had embodied the sheer force and energy of the Guggenheim line, vanished overnight, leaving behind carefully structured wealth but deeply shaken emotional ground. Immediately, the mechanisms designed to manage this dynastic wealth activated. Corporate holdings, life insurance, and trusts ensured that Florette and her children were financially secure. This system proved the success of dynastic planning. No single dramatic death could topple the family's economic engine. Lawyers and trustees seamlessly stepped into the roles previously held by the living patriarch. However, Benjamin had also lost much of his money before the sinking. The gap between the careful Seligman prudence and the high-risk Guggenheim industrial expansion suddenly became painfully concrete. Florette's response was immediate and calculated. She did not collapse publicly or indulge in displays of grief that would disrupt the social order. Instead, she sold jewels, moved the family to more modest living, and set about managing what remained. Practicality became her form of mourning. Her decisions strictly followed the Seligman family code: reduce extravagance and preserve a respectable financial footing. In practical terms, the daughters still had allowances, governesses, and schools. The emotional architecture of the household changed most significantly. Without Benjamin as a counterweight, Florette's prejudices and cold preferences gained immense freedom. Her daughters watched a single woman navigate widowhood with both sorrow and sharp social calculation. The Gilded Age widow of means possessed a specific power. She held control over marriages, a strong voice in family investments, and the authority over her children's upbringing. Florette understood this role and played it with determination. The banking instinct to treat daughters as assets in a larger alliance system remained strong. For young Peggy, this practicality felt like emotional abandonment layered upon grief. Her father's absence created a void, and her mother filled it with austerity instead of comfort. The second shattering event came 15 years later, cutting even closer to Peggy's inner life. Benita, the beloved older sister, suffered multiple miscarriages and then died in childbirth in 1927. This pattern was tragically familiar within elite families. The intense pressure to produce male heirs often ignored the physical risks placed upon women. The cost fell on a young woman whose primary role had been to carry the family line forward. After several pregnancies ended in loss, the final attempt ended in her death. For Peggy, the impact was profound and immediate. The sister who represented the conventional path, motherhood, marriage, and continuity, had followed the script exactly and paid with her life. This loss starkly illuminated the often lethal mechanics of the marriage market. Within the worlds of the Guggenheims and Seligmans, daughters were strategically positioned. Dowries, prenuptial agreements, and financial settlements translated familial affection directly into concrete figures. Apartment leases, securities, and income streams were the measurements of love. The young woman might spend seasons being presented and groomed, her social calendar organised with military precision. All this was in service of a match that satisfied family strategy. The girls themselves were often absent from the room where the legal papers were signed. When Benita died after years of miscarriages, the carefully calibrated system revealed its ultimate cost. Dynastic planners could guarantee financial security, but they could not guarantee a living daughter. The sister dynamic took on a haunting, ironic quality. The admired conventional sister who had embodied parental expectations disappeared. The less conventional, more restless sister survived and endured. This pattern, the favoured female dying young while the underestimated one prevails, is a recurring truth across many dynasties. In this case, Benita's death freed Peggy in profound and unexpected ways. The maternal pressure to become a respectable wife did not vanish, but the tragic risk associated with that performance had become terrifyingly clear. Peggy moved toward a fundamentally different model of life. She would treat marriage as a temporary episode rather than a permanent identity. She chose to use her inheritance as a tool for personal exploration, not as capital for dynastic consolidation. The underlying financial structure enabled this revolutionary shift. The Guggenheim and Seligman fortunes were not simply cash. They existed in trusts, investment portfolios, and corporations managed by professional firms. Regular income for the daughters was ensured through carefully drafted documents that specified allowances and conditions. These documents, originally intended to preserve dynastic continuity, paradoxically created a real, narrow lane of autonomy for female members. This autonomy was especially available to those not directly tied to running the core businesses. Peggy stepped into that lane with unusual creative energy. Her early encounters with the avant-garde occurred in the 1920s and 1930s while moving through European expatriate circles. Her distinction lay not just in her developing taste, but in her willingness to convert her steady inherited income into direct support for artists. The financial mechanism was straightforward. Income from trusts became stipends, purchases of sculptures and paintings, and leases for gallery spaces. Eventually, it financed the acquisition of a Venetian palazzo, the traditional pattern using wealth to endow respectable institutions shifted. Peggy used her capital to create a modernist canon through determined buying decisions. Female dynamics threaded through every aspect of this new life. Florette's lifelong scorn for new money had left her daughter with a permanent sense of never being fully approved or accepted. Benita's death turned the promise of motherhood into a source of profound dread. Later, Peggy's relationship with her own daughter, Pegeen Vale, added another layer of complexity. Pegeen grew up in the shadow of the masterpieces her mother acquired. She became a talented painter herself, producing vivid, emotionally charged works. Yet, in the broader art world, her name and canvases remained secondary, overshadowed by the collection on the walls. This mother-daughter relationship reversed the usual dynastic pattern in subtle ways. Instead of grooming her daughter for the high-stakes marriage market, Peggy prepared Pegeen for the high-stakes art world. Access came through studio visits and gallery openings, not debutante balls. Peggy introduced her daughter to painters, critics, and writers instead of supervising wardrobe fittings. Yet the fundamental dynastic dynamic persisted. A powerful maternal figure still controlled the environment, set standards, and, however unintentionally, overshadowed the child. Pegeen's career never fully detached from her mother's curatorial decisions. In death, the mother's name became synonymous with a museum. The daughter's artistic legacy is only now attracting focused attention. The house that most clearly expressed Peggy's mature understanding of power and beauty was not in New York. It stood on the Grand Canal in Venice. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, an unfinished, low-lying 18th century structure, offered a setting markedly different from the towering New York townhouses of her childhood. The long facade opened directly onto the water. Inside, the rooms unfolded in a horizontal sequence. This layout suited the display of modern art perfectly. Instead of narrow salons, there were generous open galleries where works by Pollock, Rothko, and Brancusi could breathe. The building retained traces of aristocratic sophistication. High ceilings, stone floors, and water gates for gondolas. Its unfinished upper stories left it gently humbled, grounded rather than towering over the city. Architecturally, the palazzo served as both a powerful instrument and an intimate home. The public rooms held the celebrated collection. The balance between domestic intimacy and museum ambition created a unique and specific magic. Guests moved through spaces that felt at once intimate and grand. The design converted Peggy's personal taste into a lasting public experience. Unlike the enormous symbolic ballrooms of old New York, which calculated social power by capacity, these rooms expressed a different form of influence. They demonstrated the ability to define what modern art was and to confer upon it enduring legitimacy. This architectural choice had significant implications for gender. In previous generations, male patrons built galleries and their wives orchestrated the entertainment around them. Here, a woman herself assembled the definitive collection and personally selected the building. The palazzo became a stage for female curatorship. The owner decided which artists deserved wall space and which works were granted pride of place. Her decisions shaped critical reception and influenced countless careers. The mechanism closely resembled older forms of female social control who received invitations or sat where at a dinner party. Now, however, the stakes involved artistic immortality rather than mere marriage prospects. The tragedies of Peggy's early life never fully receded. The trauma of her father's public catastrophe and the private agony of Benita's death remained active forces in her memory. This left her acutely aware of how little control individuals held over life and death. It also highlighted how much control families attempted to exert over narrative, reputation, and the distribution of wealth. This combination of fragility and structural power explains much of her later generosity toward artists. Many of the men and women whose work she acquired had uncertain futures, unstable housing, and little money. She converted her predictable dynastic income into a crucial safety net for them, buying consistently and early in their careers. Yet, even within the art world she created, forgotten women appear in the archives. Wives and partners of male artists often acted as overlooked creators, emotional anchors, studio managers, and translators. Their contributions rarely appear in official biographies. However, they formed the essential background texture of the world from which modern art emerged. Secretaries managed correspondence. Gallery assistants organised shows. Women in artists' households stretched modest funds because a cheque arrived unexpectedly from a Guggenheim patron. Peggy's final legal decisions about her collection reflected a sophisticated understanding of dynastic tools. Rather than leaving everything to private heirs who might disperse the works, she structured complex agreements. These ensured the collection would remain intact as a public institution. This was the repurposing of dynastic planning. Instead of preserving a family name through a mining company, the mechanism preserved an artistic vision through a museum and a foundation. Patterns emerge when placing Peggy's story alongside those of other heiresses. A charismatic father whose public image was a mix of legend and scandal disappears dramatically. A mother from an established banking family polices class boundaries even within great wealth. An older sister satisfies all conventional expectations and dies young. A younger, less conventional sister survives. This survivor uses a portion of the dynasty's capital to build a different legacy, one focused on cultural influence rather than corporate control. Finally, a daughter grows up under the shadow of that project, simultaneously benefiting from and being overshadowed by it. The story clarifies the difference between cultural myth and financial mechanism. Peggy is often framed as a singularly daring figure who broke completely from her heritage. While true, this framing can obscure the essential financial scaffolding beneath her choices. Her capacity to take risks with experimental art came directly from the predictable trust income. This income was established long before her birth. Her ability to maintain a palazzo museum in Venice depended on the compounded results of smelters, mines, and financial instruments created by others. The genuine originality lies in her choice of allocation. She chose to direct already secured resources toward experimental culture rather than mere industrial expansion. Seen through the lens of female experience, Peggy Guggenheim's life is a complex variation within a familiar system. A mother's judgments deeply imprint on a daughter's sense of belonging. Sisters mirror and oppose each other, leading to opposing fates. A woman who witnessed the lethal cost of reproductive expectation approaches marriage warily. She ultimately defines herself through patronage and work instead of conventional roles. A generation later, her own daughter struggles with the immense weight of a famous mother's choices while attempting to create in her own right. At the end of this complex chain stands the museum on the Grand Canal. Visitors walk through rooms arranged much as Peggy herself left them. Sculptures that once framed private conversations now anchor public spaces. The institution honours not only the artists on its walls, but also the difficult path that carried a mining fortune through a grieving widow, a lost sister, an unconventional collector, and a troubled daughter. The life of Peggy Guggenheim is not a simple tale of rebellion. It is a precise record of how women within a powerful family absorbed trauma, navigated complex hierarchies, and rechanneled inherited systems toward entirely new cultural ends. A mother who judged, a sister who died, a daughter who struggled, and a collector who turned the tools of dynasty into a powerful monument. All these figures coexist within the same layered story.